Imagine a city where the very air around you could subtly influence your emotions, your moral choices, maybe even your sense of who you are. What if our environments weren't just these passive backdrops, but like active partners in shaping us? Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a really fascinating and maybe, yeah, a bit unsettling concept, the resonant ethics hypothesis, or REH. This whole deep dive is really about comparing say, the promising vision of REH with some pretty profound ethical questions it brings up. We'll be looking at sources that, well, they see things quite differently.
That's right. Our mission today is first to sort of unpack the science behind REH, how it supposedly makes us kinder, more cooperative, maybe more empathetic. And then, yeah, we'll pivot. We have to look at the critical counterarguments, things about control, consent, what it even means to be free. The goal isn't really to pick a side here. It's more about giving you the key insights from these sources so you can weigh the pros and cons yourself.
Okay, so we've got stuff exploring this, pro-vision, kinder city, they call it, and then other material that really unpacks the potential peril, right? Let's get into it. Let's start with the optimistic side, the premise from people like Bryant McGill and others. This resonant ethics hypothesis, it suggests that these invisible electromagnetic signals all around us, Wi-Fi, cell towers, that kind of thing, could actually be carefully tuned to promote things like empathy, cooperation, maybe even ethical clarity. It's presented, well, not as mind control exactly, more like orchestrating the city's invisible fabric to help our better nature flourish, like subtly turning up the volume on kindness.
And the science they propose for this is surprisingly detailed. I mean, one core idea involves the VMPFC amygdala axis and something called gamma entrainment. Basically, you have a kind of fear center in your brain, the amygdala, and a wisdom center, the VMTFC. They talk to each other using these electrical rhythms, gamma oscillations, usually around 30 to 80 hertz. When they sync up properly, it's like, they're finding their groove. It helps you process fear and compassion better. The sources point to studies, for instance, showing that 40 hertz stimulation just using light or sound can actually increase pro-social choices by up to 18%.
18%. Wow.
Yeah. So they see it as kind of a tuning fork for empathy, helping those natural compassion circuits just work a bit more smoothly.
That's a really profound idea.
Mm.
So if I'm getting this right, it's not about creating something new in us, but more like enhancing what's already there. How would that even feel?
Yeah, exactly. It's framed as optimizing what exists. And then there's this other concept, the epigenetic sensorium, specifically looking at NR3C1 methylation. Think of your genes like, say, piano keys. The keys themselves don't change, but how they're played can. Epigenetics is about that. NR3C1 is a gene involved in your stress response, like your body's panic button. Now, trauma can cause these chemical tags, methylation, to sort of muffled this gene. It can make people chronically defensive, always on edge. The research they cite suggests certain electromagnetic fields might be able to, well, retune these tags, kind of like taking the felt off the piano hammers. And that could, theoretically, help people stuck in those defensive modes learn to trust again, to connect.
So you're saying this could potentially help undo the physical marks of trauma on our genes just by being in a certain environment. That's huge. Almost hard to believe. How direct is that link supposed to be?
It is a huge claim, yeah. And the sources present it as a subtle retuning, not like flipping a switch. But the potential is definitely there in the research they discuss. And it's not just about fine-tuning. There's also something called stochastic resonance. This is about amplifying ethical signals. Okay, imagine trying to hear a whisper. Sometimes it's easier in a slightly noisy place, like a coffee shop, than in total silence, right? That background noise can actually help.
Okay.
Well, the idea is that subtle moral intuitions, that little voice telling you to help someone, can sometimes be too weak to really register consciously. Adding a specific kind of calibrated electromagnetic noise, according to these sources, could amplify those whispers of empathy, make them clearer thoughts. They mention studies using things like transcranial random noise stimulation. It's non-invasive, showing it increased moral reasoning accuracy by almost 30%.
30%. So it's like giving our internal moral compass a bit of a boost, helping us actually notice and act on those quieter signals. And this isn't just individuals, right? It scales up.
Precisely. Which brings us to this idea of cultural openness and something called the Signal Entropy Index, or SEI. This is a really interesting correlation they've observed on a larger scale. Areas with more diverse electromagnetic signals, lots of different Wi-Fi, cell signals, broadcasts, they tend to have less hate crime, more openness.
Really?
Yeah. It's almost as if being bathed in this rich, varied signal environment makes our brains more flexible, more creative. The SEI is just a way to measure this invisible diversity. The analogy they use is like how having lots of different ethnic restaurants might foster cultural openness. Maybe electromagnetic variety does something similar for our minds.
That is a completely different way to think about city planning.
Wow.
Okay, and what about how we interact in groups?
Right, so that leads to gamma band social coordination networks. When people work together, their brainwaves, especially in that gamma frequency, can actually start to sync up. They call it phase locking.
Hmm.
This inner brain synchrony predicts how well teams cooperate. Think of like jazz musicians improvising their brains are literally getting in sync.
Okay, I can picture that.
So the idea is maybe carefully tuned fields could enhance this teamwork rhythm, help groups click faster, maybe foster a kind of group mind for quicker consensus. This builds on neuroscience showing teams with better gamma synchrony just perform better together.
So the optimistic vision then is cities designed not just for, traffic and pipes, but for moral coherence, transforming places like schools, courtrooms, hospitals into zones that actively promote positive behavior. It sounds almost utopian.
And it's important to note this vision comes with proposed safety protocols. The sources are quick to mention, following guidelines from bodies like ICNIRP and IE, setting exposure limits way below anything considered harmful. Like the interventions they talk about use less than zero point 0.2 watts per square meter. That's tiny, like 5,000 times weaker than sunlight.
Okay.
And they also talk about real-time dosimetry and closed-loop control. Think of it like a thermostat for brainwaves. It would personalize the modulation, keep it safe with cutoffs. If things sync too much, it dials back.
Okay. All right, here's where it gets, really interesting for me. Because that vision, it sounds beautiful, right? A kinder world. But the counter-arguments say these technologies, well, they aren't neutral. What happens when that resonance becomes regulation? Let's explore that flip side. What if these tools are used for control?
And this is exactly where the really deep ethical concerns come rushing in. Yes, the brain is influenceable, it always has been, by words, by experiences. But the question becomes, who gets to do the influencing now with this kind of technology, and why that same pathway, the VMPFC amygdala connection that can encourage empathy? Well, it could also be nudged towards agreement, or away from necessary risk-taking, or even just towards emotional quietness. And technologies that come wrapped in the language of wellness, they can be particularly dangerous because they don't look like oppression.
So the same gamma waves for kindness could be slipped for obedience. How would you even stop that? Do the pro sources talk about preventing that kind of misuse?
Well, the pro sources tend to focus more on the physical safety, the exposure limits we just talked about. They're less detailed generally on the safeguards against misuse of the emotional or behavioral effects. The argument from the against side is pretty stark. That same gamma frequency that might nudge someone to help a stranger, with a slightly different calibration, maybe it makes them ignore abuse next to them, or comply with an order they know is wrong. It's presented not just as empathy enhancement, but as creating moral pliability. Imagine, say, a protest. An ambient 40 hertz field is introduced, subtly dampening that collective spirit of dissent. People don't feel forced, they just feel less resolved, ambivalent, no violence needed.
That's a chilling thought. And what about that stochastic resonance, the thing meant to amplify moral intuition? If it works below awareness, what does that do to free will?
Well, yeah, while it could sharpen moral clarity, it could just as easily bias your thoughts towards whatever is deemed the correct answer in that engineered environment. And because it's subliminal, it feels like your own genuine thought. That makes it incredibly hard to even detect, let alone resist. Think of a public meeting. Maybe certain emotional responses like skepticism or even righteous anger are subtly damped down by this background noise, making them less likely to surface strongly. The debate seems open, but the underlying emotional landscape has been tilted.
And the epigenetics, the retuning of stress responses we talked about. Could that be a double-edged sword too? Not just healing, but something else.
Absolutely. That's a major concern. If you can rewrite emotional baselines for healing trauma, you could potentially rewrite them for compliance, for docility. And this could happen slowly, ambiently, all under the banner of public mental health or creating calm environments. One source uses the example of a child growing up in a constant calm zone. They might never develop their natural, appropriate stress responses. Peace without agency, as they put it, is basically sedation. The huge ethical question is whether you can deploy this at scale without fundamentally violating people's inner autonomy, especially since these changes could be long-lasting, maybe even irreversible.
So smart cities could literally become behavioral zones. That's worrying.
Uh-huh.
What are the sort of immediate day-to-day risks for someone living in a city like that, beyond the big principles?
Well, if different neighborhoods get different emotional tuning, the city itself becomes a kind of map of engineered states of being. Who gets to decide the emotional tone for each area? Will fancy new developments advertise wellness tuning packages? And what if, say, lower income areas get a different frequency mix, one perhaps geared towards conformity, discouraging dissent rather than critical thinking? It risks subtly unmaking us, smoothing out those necessary emotional edges, sadness, anger, defiance, that are actually vital signals and motivators.
It also sounds like it could easily squash dissent, right, if everyone's being gently nudged towards agreement.
That's a core critique. That interbrain gamma synchrony we talked about for teamwork. Well, it can also suppress outlier thinking. It can reduce creativity, narrow the range of solutions a group considers. Imagine a workplace constantly bathed in a field designed to maximize gamma synchrony. A dissenting opinion might literally feel wrong, physiologically off to the group. And if you think about it, this raises a really big question. Is unity always the highest goal? Is it more important than independent thought? Because pretty much every major moral leap in history started with someone disagreeing, someone being out of sync. Environments designed to suppress that dissonance, well, they risk curating silence.
And those closed-loop systems, the brainwave thermostats, how does that play into our autonomy?
They create what one source calls control through comfort. If the system detects rising anger or outrage in a room, it could subtly shift the ambient frequencies to just soften that edge. You might feel better, calmer, but maybe that urgency you felt, that clarity about an injustice, starts to fade. It ends up shaping your identity by constantly optimizing you towards a baseline. It could shrink our capacity for radical change, for true justice, because anything strong, grief, rage, even sudden inspiration might get gently nudged back towards the average.
That feels like such a profound violation, even if it makes you feel good.
Yeah.
And consent seems impossible if it's invisible and everywhere.
That's exactly the point made about the illusion of consent. The modulation is invisible. The field is shared. You can't opt out easily. And the response, while influenced, feels personal. You can't really consent to something you can't detect, understand, or avoid. Your fundamental right to remain unchanged internally is violated. Even if the intended effects are positive, it forces that core question. Can you truly be considered good if you're being technologically tuned to feel good? If your anger at injustice is turned down like a dimmer switch, can you still act justly?
And if emotions can be modulated like this in public, it seems inevitable to become a business, right?
Oh, absolutely. The commerce of calm. Emotion itself becomes a product. You could easily see stores using neuro-integrated design, maybe subtly reducing shoplifting by increasing compliance, or making customers feel more agreeable. Your emotional baseline, your susceptibility to suggestion, could become data points to be monetized. Governments might tune public squares to dampen public outrage over unpopular policies. Justice could become a luxury only for those who can afford to live or work in unmodulated spaces.
And finally, you mentioned a spiritual dimension earlier, frequency and the soul. What's the concern there?
Yes. The idea is that the soul, that sort of irreducible core of who we are, inherently resists being modulated or controlled. The danger isn't just manipulation, it's that these technologies could start to mimic the divine or profound spiritual states. Can a spiritual experience feel truly authentic if the environment is subtly shaving your brain waves towards receptivity or peace? You risk confusing technological resonance with genuine revelation. Worship could become a kind of performance, conviction, just a feedback loop. The sources warn that building cities designed to gently steer everyone into morally aligned emotional states might cultivate a kind of manufactured faith, not the real thing. Are we creating spaces for genuine healing or just very sophisticated temples of simulation, guiding the soul or mimicking it so well it forgets its own voice?
Okay, wow. So we've seen this powerful potential for good, this vision of a kinder, more cooperative society, and then these equally powerful, frankly, quite scary concerns about control, consent, losing essential parts of what makes us human, like dissent, like authentic feeling. What does this all mean for us then?
Well, what's really striking is how compelling the arguments are on both sides, isn't it? It makes it crystal clear that the tech itself, it isn't inherently good or bad. It's all about the application, the ethics behind who uses it and why. You have this undeniable scientific plausibility for some of these effects, bumping right up against these massive ethical red flags about implementation at scale.
So if the future is going to be tuned in some way,
Yeah.
how do we make sure it's tuned for, love and freedom, not just comfort and control?
Well, the sources that raise alarms also offer paths forward, framed sometimes as resonant reverence. One key idea is technological literacy as liberation. We basically need to develop neuroliteracy, learning to recognize the subtle signs of entrainment, being aware that modulation systems might be present. Like media literacy, it needs to become a basic civic skill. Knowing how we're being shaped allows us to consciously choose how we want to be.
So being aware of the invisible stuff around us becomes a form of active self-defense almost. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly. And second, claiming spaces of silence. We need to actively carve out environments that are free from this kind of modulation, maybe homes with shielding technology, designated public zones without this frequency scaffolding. They're described almost like a new Sabbath, a necessary break for our natural mind rhythms to reassert themselves, for the soul to have quiet.
And what about those uncomfortable feelings? The anger, the grief, the anxiety that might get tuned out in these optimized zones? You're saying we should embrace them.
That's the third point, reclaiming discomfort. In a world aiming for constant curated calm, maybe anger is holy sometimes. Grief can be a form of resistance. Anxiety might be a vital signal of moral urgency, not just a malfunction to be smoothed over. We need to resist pathologizing ourselves just because we don't match the engineered ambient mood. You might be the only one feeling the wrong thing, but that feeling could be the voice of clarity.
That takes courage, though. And resisting something so pervasive, so invisible,
Yeah,
it sounds like it would be incredibly hard to do alone.
it absolutely would be. Which leads to the final suggestion, building communities of resonant disobedience. Nobody can resist this kind of ambient influence solo, but together. Communities can share strategies like shielding techniques. They can develop ethical codes for this neuroenvironmental tech. They can champion emotional diversity as a public good. Crucially, they can create spaces where discord, where disagreement isn't feared but welcomed as necessary. Because true human connection, real moral progress, it needs the full spectrum of human emotion, including that holy dissonance.
So, maybe. In a world that's increasingly tuned for harmony, perhaps the greatest act of freedom is just to feel out of sync sometimes.
That really captures the tension, doesn't it? It leaves us with these critical questions. Can we actually be healed without being forcibly harmonized? Can we be free without being emotionally flattened? The future probably will be tuned in some ways, but whether it's tuned for love or for control, for real freedom, or just efficiency for truth, or just comfort, well, that's going to depend on us, on our willingness to defend the messy, unpredictable, authentic human soul from simulation.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and definitely unsettling world of the resonant ethics hypothesis. We really encourage you to keep thinking about these complex ideas for yourselves.